Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How are you today? Take care of your health, because we are all old. Now, prepare a cup of coffee, and we will go straight to today's interesting story. Comment where you are watching the video, and we will begin. Richard Stone, a self-made billionaire and CEO of Stone Enterprises, sat in his luxurious penthouse high above the dazzling city lights of New York City, a crystal glass of whiskey in hand. To him, the bustling world below appeared trivial, a reflection of how he regarded most people. At 43, Richard epitomized success in high finance, possessing wealth, power, and influence. Yet behind his impeccably tailored suits and polished exterior lurked an unwavering arrogance, honed by years of unchallenged dominance. His social circle mirrored his personality, elitist, self-congratulatory, and detached from everyday realities. That evening, he hosted one of his renowned cocktail parties, where the city's most influential mingled, champagne flowed freely, and conversations revolved around lucrative investments, extravagant vacations, and the occasional sneer at those outside their exclusive realm. As Richard moved gracefully among the guests, exchanging pleasantries and basking in admiration, his longtime friend and occasional rival Daniel Rivers intercepted him by the marble bar. "Still the same, Richard," Daniel said with a smirk as he swirled his wine. "Always a man with the perfect life." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Would you expect anything less?" he replied. Daniel chuckled. "Not at all, but tell me, don't you ever tire of it all, the same parties, the same people, the same routine?" Leaning on the bar with a sip of whiskey, Richard retorted, "Tired? Hardly. Why change what works?" Daniel's smirk broadened, mischief glinting in his eyes. "You're too predictable, Richard. You've built an empire, yes, but also walls so high that nothing ever surprises you. Don't you crave a real challenge?" Intrigued yet cautious, Richard tilted his head. "What kind of challenge?" Daniel lowered his voice conspiratorially. "A genuine challenge, something outside your realm of control, something or someone you cannot simply buy, manipulate, or dominate." Richard laughed sharply. "There is no such thing." "Oh, but I think there is," Daniel insisted, straightening up. "I'll bet you a hefty sum that you can't step out of your comfort zone. I bet that if you marry someone completely unlike the women you usually choose, a woman who doesn't fit your mold and isn't conventionally attractive by your standards, someone from an entirely different world, and remain married for 6 months, you'll find that life isn't as predictable as you believe." Richard set his glass down, his mind racing at the absurdity and allure of the wager. "What isn't it for me?" he asked. Leaning in, Daniel's tone softened, but his eyes were sharp. "If you win, I'll personally invest $50 million into Stone Enterprises, no strings attached. But if you lose, your reputation as the invincible winner will suffer a serious blow." Smirking confidently, Richard accepted. The conversation shifted, yet the bet lingered in his thoughts. He prided himself on conquering any challenge, and this unconventional wager seemed like just another game to win. Over the next week, Richard set his team in motion. His assistant, Samantha, discreetly compiled a list of potential candidates, women who were entirely removed from his affluent world yet met Daniel's criteria. Scanning the profiles with detached curiosity, each name felt like another deal to negotiate until he encountered her, Lisa Martin. Unlike the typical women in his world, Lisa immediately stood out. A 36-year-old African-American woman with a full, curvaceous figure, Lisa was a social worker who ran a non-profit organization dedicated to helping underserved communities. Uninterested in high society and luxury, she carried a fiery reputation for standing her ground. Richard smirked. She would be perfect. Under the guise of discussing a potential partnership with her nonprofit, which she named Hope Rise, Richard arranged a meeting. When Lisa walked into his office, he was struck by her presence. Her natural curls framed a warm yet resolute face. Her attire was simple, but professional, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of the women he usually encountered. "Mr. Stone," she greeted, extending a hand, "thank you for reaching out. I wasn't expecting a man of your stature to take an interest in our work." Though polite, her words carried a subtle challenge. Richard smiled, masking his intrigue. "Miss Martin, I believe in supporting meaningful causes. Your work caught my attention." During the meeting, Lisa explained her nonprofit's mission and the obstacles they faced in securing funding. Richard listened intently while mentally formulating his proposition. Then, shifting his tone to one of quiet authority, he leaned forward. "Lisa, I have a proposal, a mutually beneficial arrangement that could provide your organization with the resources it desperately needs." Her eyes narrowed in skepticism. "What kind of proposal?" she asked. Richard's smile broadened as he delivered his shocking pitch, "Marry me." A heavy silence fell. Richard carefully outlined the terms, artfully omitting the true nature of the wager. He portrayed the marriage as an arrangement that would grant her funding and visibility, while enhancing his public image. Lisa's expression remained unreadable as she absorbed his words. She was weighing her options, intelligent and cautious, qualities that both frustrated and intrigued Richard. "I'll need time to think," she finally said. Richard nodded, certain that high stakes would eventually sway her. In his mind, he would win after all. He was Richard Stone, the man who always triumphed. In the ensuing week, Richard mobilized his resources. Samantha discreetly gathered potential candidates, but it was Lisa who captured his attention. Her defiance and independence, so unlike his usual type, struck him as a promising challenge. Soon, their meeting was arranged under the pretense of a partnership discussion. When Lisa arrived, her calm confidence and unyielding demeanor made a lasting impression on Richard. As they discussed her nonprofit's struggles, Richard calculated how best to present his proposition. Then, with an authoritative tone, he proposed marriage, a sham deal to test his adaptability. Though Lisa listened intently, her eyes conveyed caution and disbelief. Days later, Lisa sat in her modest office surrounded by paperwork and community grant applications. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered as she pored over yet another rejection letter. Frustration tugged at her, yet she refused to succumb. For 10 years, she had dedicated herself to Hope Rise, a nonprofit providing housing, education, and career opportunities for those in need. Despite the relentless challenges, her belief in her mission remained steadfast. Her phone buzzed, a message from Samantha confirming a follow-up meeting with Richard. Lisa's brow furrowed. Billionaires like him rarely took an interest in grassroots organizations. Yet, there was something in his proposal, a blend of audacity and intrigue that lingered in her thoughts. When Lisa returned to Richard's sleek corporate office the next day, she felt entirely out of place amid towering glass walls and cold, pristine interiors, a far cry from the vibrant community center where she spent her days. Still, she entered with her head held high, determined not to let the surroundings diminish her resolve. Richard greeted her with his signature charm and gestured toward a plush leather chair. "Miss Martin, thank you for coming back. I assume you've had time to consider my proposal?" he said smoothly. Lisa crossed her arms and replied, "I've thought about it, but I still don't understand why a man like you would propose something so unconventional. A marriage proposal wasn't what I expected when you offered help." Leaning back, Richard explained, "Let us be honest, people like me are scrutinized. A partnership like this can benefit both parties. You need funding for your organization, and I need to demonstrate my commitment to meaningful causes. Lisa tilted her head. So you're after a public relations move? She challenged. Not just that, Richard countered with a hint of amusement. I believe in mutually beneficial arrangements. This is business, Miss Martin, nothing more. For Lisa, whose work was deeply personal and tied to her identity and struggles, Richard's transactional view was disheartening. If I agree, I have conditions. My independence is non-negotiable. I will continue my work without your interference, and every cent you provide goes directly to the community, she stated firmly. Richard's smile widened as he accepted, understood. Lisa added, and if at any point I feel this arrangement compromises my values, I'll walk away. No amount of money will keep me here. With that, their agreement was sealed with a firm handshake. The wedding was arranged swiftly, with minimal fanfare. Richard ensured the ceremony, though small, exuded elegance. Lisa arrived in a simple ivory dress, rejecting the stylistic demands of Richard's team. In the pristine chapel, surrounded by Richard's polished acquaintances and distant relatives, Lisa felt like an outsider, her absence of personal support a deliberate choice to avoid explaining the situation. As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Lisa caught a glimpse of Richard's pleased expression, as if he had just closed a lucrative deal. Internally, she felt a churn of unease. At the reception, the atmosphere remained impersonal. While Richard moved among his guests, engaging in superficial pleasantries, Lisa sat quietly at a corner table, observing the spectacle. She felt like a mere prop in Richard's elaborate chess game. Despite her discomfort, she reminded herself of the stakes, the crucial funding for Hope Rise. Their first night as a married couple set the tone for their arrangement. Richard escorted Lisa to his sprawling penthouse, a space filled with modern art, gleaming surfaces, and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city skyline. "This is your home now," he declared formally, confident she would eventually find it comfortable. Lisa's neutral expression betrayed nothing as she silently unpacked in the guest room, a clear sign that she intended to maintain her own space. Richard raised an eyebrow in silent disapproval, but said nothing as he retreated to his own room. In the weeks that followed, their dynamic began to take shape. True to his word, Richard transferred substantial funds to Hope Rise, enabling Lisa to expand her programs and hire additional staff. Yet, despite the material benefits, tension simmered between them. Accustomed to being the center of attention, Richard found Lisa's indifference both baffling and infuriating. She refused his invitations to high society events, choosing instead to focus on her work. Lisa maintained her boundaries with unwavering determination, dismissing lavish gifts and extravagant gestures. When Richard presented her with a diamond necklace, she politely declined, saying, "I'd rather see that money go toward building a new community center." Richard's frustration grew, though he masked it with his usual confident air, believing he could eventually bend her will. What he didn't anticipate was that Lisa's strength and resolve would continue to challenge him in unforeseen ways. One day, a glossy black car pulled into a rundown neighborhood. Richard, dressed in a tailored suit, sat in the back seat, gazing through tinted windows at crumbling buildings, faded graffiti, and uneven sidewalks filled with children at play. This was a world utterly foreign to him, almost as if he were watching a documentary. Lisa had insisted he accompany her to one of Hope Rise's community events. For her, it was a chance to showcase the work that meant everything for Richard. It was merely another obligation to uphold his facade. The car stopped in front of a converted warehouse, now a bustling community center adorned with a bright mural that defied the neighborhood's gray monotony. Lisa, dressed casually in jeans and a navy t-shirt emblazoned with Hope Rise, efficiently directed volunteers. Her purpose was evident as she greeted families, comforted children, and organized donations. Despite his reservations, Richard watched her with a mix of curiosity and unease. Stepping out of the car, he immediately felt out of place. His tailored suit and Italian shoes seemed a glaring misfit amid the local atmosphere. Heads turned, some with curiosity, others with disdain, while Richard straightened his shoulders and pushed aside his discomfort. Lisa greeted him briskly. "Glad you could make it. Let us start with the food pantry." Inside, rows of tables were laden with donated goods, canned food, fresh produce, and bags of rice. Volunteers worked efficiently, handing out supplies to families who, though tired and worn, expressed genuine gratitude. As Lisa explained the process, Richard couldn't help but think of the millions that flowed through his company daily, though he quickly reined in his thoughts. They moved on to an after-school tutoring area, where children worked with volunteer teachers amid colorful posters and drawings. Lisa knelt beside a young boy struggling with math, and Richard watched from a distance, feeling like an intruder in a world he barely understood. "Why do you do this?" Richard finally asked when Lisa rejoined him. "You've poured your life into this work. Why?" Lisa's gaze was steady as she replied, "Because someone has to. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to struggle, and to wonder if anyone cares. I cannot stand idly by when I can help." Her words unsettled Richard. They forced him to confront a truth he'd long avoided. His world, built on profit and power, had no room for genuine empathy. As the day progressed, and Lisa led him through every corner of the center, meeting single mothers, hopeful teenagers, and grateful elderly residents, each encounter chipped away at his self-assured facade. By the time they returned to the car, Richard was uncharacteristically quiet. The silence between them was heavy as he stared out the window, his mind racing with uncertainty about his life and decisions beyond his ivory tower. That night in the penthouse, as Richard poured himself a drink and gazed out over the glittering city skyline, a view that once filled him with pride it now felt hollow. The faces he'd seen earlier, the exhausted mother, the trembling elderly man, the aspiring teenager, haunted him. These were people he would have dismissed only weeks before, and now he felt the undeniable weight of a reality he had long ignored. When Lisa returned home with a box of leftover donations, she silently passed through the kitchen. Richard, watching her from the living room, finally set his glass down. "Today was different," he murmured. Lisa looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Is that your way of saying you're uncomfortable?" she asked, her tone sharp yet not unkind. "Maybe it's not the kind of environment I'm used to. That's obvious," she replied. "But perhaps that's the problem. You've built your life in a bubble. You don't know what it's like to struggle, to worry about rent or feeding a family." Her words stung, and though Richard longed to defend his success, he simply nodded. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "I don't understand, but I'd like to." Lisa regarded him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "We'll see," she said, adding, "Actions speak louder than words." Richard's silence spoke volumes. He had always prided himself on winning, but this was a game, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if victory was even the goal. As the evening wore on, Richard found himself thinking less about the wager and more about Lisa, the woman who had inadvertently upended his world. Lisa was unlike anyone he had ever met, strong, unyielding, and deeply compassionate. She challenged him in ways he hadn't known he needed, and though he would never admit it aloud, he found himself wanting to rise to her challenge. In the days that followed, Richard's uncertainty grew. He had always believed control was his greatest asset, every decision calculated to maintain power over his life and those around him. Yet Lisa's steadfast independence proved immune to his influence, testing his patience and shattering his carefully constructed world. Instead of reflecting on his discomfort, Richard reverted to his old methods of asserting control. The morning after the community center visit, he entered the kitchen in his tailored suit with his confidence seemingly restored. Lisa was already there, absorbed in her work, sipping coffee while reading a report on her laptop. "You know, Richard," she remarked casually as he poured himself a cup, "if you spent less time buried in those papers and more time at events with me, you might actually enjoy yourself." "Enjoy myself?" Richard scoffed. "At one of your society galas, where people pretend to care about causes they don't understand." "No, thank you." His jaw tightened. "Those galas raise millions and are effective for the organizers, but they rarely make a real difference." Lisa's words struck a nerve, challenging the very foundation of his beliefs. Instead of engaging further, Richard changed tactics. "I have a charity event tonight," he said lightly. "It would mean a lot if you joined me." Lisa's expression remained unmoved. "By a lot you mean it will look good for your image," she replied firmly. "I'm not interested in networking with people who have no understanding of what I do." Her refusal left Richard simmering with frustration. He had assumed his wealth and influence would eventually win her over, but Lisa proved a far greater challenge. That evening, Richard attended the gala alone. Held in a glittering ballroom filled with New York's elite, the event buzzed with discussions of investments, art auctions, and charitable donations that doubled as tax write-offs. Richard moved effortlessly through the room, yet his thoughts remained fixated on Lisa, her sharp words, her quiet strength, and the way she had dismissed everything he held dear. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of self-doubt. Were all his philanthropic efforts merely performative gestures? The unsettling thought forced him to drown his uncertainty in yet another glass of champagne. The next day, Richard adopted a more aggressive strategy. If Lisa refused to embrace his world, he would impose it upon her. He began scheduling events and meetings that required her presence, framing them as essential for Hope Rise's visibility. Lisa attended a few reluctantly, quickly growing weary of the superficiality. At one luncheon hosted by one of Richard's business partners, she found herself sitting between two women more interested in gossip than substance. One of them leaned over, her diamond earrings catching the light. "So, how did you and Richard meet? It must have been quite the whirlwind romance." Forced to smile politely, Lisa replied, "We met through mutual connections." The woman pressed further, inquiring about her work. "I run a non-profit organization," Lisa explained calmly, focusing on providing resources and support for underserved communities. The woman's interest waned immediately, leaving Lisa to bite back a retort. Frustration simmered as she glanced at Richard, who was engrossed in conversation with another guest, oblivious to her discomfort. Later, during the car ride home, Lisa finally broke the silence. "This isn't working," she said. Richard looked at her, expression unreadable. "What isn't?" She gestured between them. "You dragging me to events where no one cares about what I do, it's a waste of time." Richard countered, "These events are opportunities to build connections. You could secure funding if you played your cards right." Lisa shook her head. "You still don't understand, do you? I'm not interested in playing games or pandering to people who only care about appearances. My work is about real issues, not impressing your friends." Her words cut through Richard's defenses, yet instead of acknowledging her point, he doubled down. "Sometimes you have to compromise, Lisa. That's how the world works." "Maybe in your world," she retorted, "but I won't compromise my values for convenience." Over the following weeks, their conflicts escalated. Richard's attempts to control aspects of Hope Rise became more overt, subtly questioning Lisa's decisions and even suggesting alternative uses for the funds he provided. Lisa resisted fiercely, unwilling to let him dictate her work. One evening, their argument reached a climax. "You think you're so righteous," Richard snapped, "but the truth is, without my money, your non-profit wouldn't survive." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "You're right, your money has helped. But that doesn't give you the right to control me or dictate how I work. I built this organization from scratch, and I will keep fighting for it with or without you." Her words struck Richard harder than he expected. For a moment, he saw her not as a challenge to conquer, but as someone who had endured far more than he ever had. Overwhelmed by the realization, he retreated to his study, pouring himself another drink as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. In the days that followed, Lisa immersed herself in her work at Hope Rise, while Richard withdrew into his business dealings. Yet the tension between them remained palpable. Richard couldn't shake the memory of Lisa's defiant words. One afternoon, while scrolling through Hope Rise's social media page, he watched videos of Lisa passionately advocating for her cause and read testimonials from those whose lives had been transformed by her work: a single mother who had found stable housing, a young man who earned a scholarship through the center's tutoring program, an elderly woman who finally felt seen. The stories humbled him, igniting a self-reflection he had long avoided. For the first time, he questioned the true value of his achievements. His billions had bought him power and prestige, but had they made a real difference? Determined to bridge the gap, Richard decided to meet Lisa on her turf. One unannounced morning, he arrived at Hope Rise, stepping into the bustling center with its worn walls and mismatched furniture. The air buzzed with energy as volunteers sorted donations, children played, and a group of seniors discussed plans for a community garden. Although Richard felt out of place, he pushed through his discomfort. He soon spotted Lisa, who was directing volunteers with calm authority. When she noticed him, her tone was sharp. "What are you doing here?" Crossing her arms, he replied simply, "I wanted to see what you do." Lisa's eyebrow arched. "And why the sudden interest?" she asked. Initially trying to prove a point, Richard then admitted, "I realized I've been wrong about a lot of things." Despite her evident skepticism, Lisa did not dismiss him outright. Instead, she handed him a clipboard. "If you're serious, start by helping. We're restocking supplies for the food pantry." Richard took the clipboard without protest and spent the next few hours alongside the volunteers, organizing boxes of canned goods and packing bags for families in need. The work was tedious, but it granted him a new perspective. As he listened to volunteers share their struggles and hopes, he observed that many had been beneficiaries of Hope Rise and were now giving back to the community. Lisa watched him closely, noting how out of place he seemed, yet surprised by his silent perseverance. By the end of the day, his crisp suit had transformed into rolled-up sleeves and a loosened tie, a striking image of an ordinary man striving to do something meaningful. That evening, as they closed up the center, Richard approached Lisa, who was tidying up a table of brochures. "Thank you," he said softly, "for letting me see this." Lisa looked up, surprised. "For what?" she inquired. "For giving me the chance to understand," he replied, his voice softer than usual. Lisa's expression softened slightly, though caution remained. "Understanding is one thing, Richard, but this isn't a one-time gesture. These people need consistency, not empty gestures." He met her steady gaze. "I want to help not just with money, but with my time, my connections, whatever I can do to support your mission." Lisa studied him carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. For the first time, she saw something genuine in him, a vulnerability that wasn't there before. "I'm glad you're starting to see things differently," she said quietly. "But change takes time, and trust takes even longer." Richard nodded, accepting her words. For the first time, he wasn't chasing a quick victory. Instead, he was determined to prove himself through consistent actions. In the weeks that followed, Richard followed through on his promise. He began spending more time at Hope Rise, not as a benefactor, but as a volunteer. He attended meetings, helped organize events, and even participated in a fundraising campaign. Slowly, he earned the trust of the staff and volunteers, though many remained wary of his intentions. Lisa, who had once seen him as an arrogant man, now recognized his sincere efforts to understand a world that had long been invisible to him. One afternoon in the food pantry, as they worked side by side, Richard admitted quietly, "You were right about everything. I spent my life chasing things that don't matter: money, power, status. I thought they'd bring happiness, but they haven't." Lisa paused, placing a can of soup into a bag, and asked softly, "What changed?" Richard, with a clarity that surprised even himself, responded, "You showed me a different way of living, a way I never considered before. And now, I can't stop thinking about it." Lisa's expression was inscrutable. "I'm glad you're beginning to see," she said, "but change takes time and trust." Richard nodded. "This isn't just about you," he added. "It's about becoming the kind of man I can live with." For the first time, he felt he was on the right path. Months later, at a Hope Rise event, they stood together not as business partners or mere acquaintances, but as equals, ready to face the challenges ahead. As the sunset bathed the community center in a warm glow, Richard turned to Lisa. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me a chance to change." Lisa smiled faintly. "Just don't waste it, Richard," he promised. "I won tea." Yet the past was not so easily erased. One evening, as Richard sat alone in his penthouse, his phone buzzed with an email from a Hope Rise volunteer, accompanied by a photo of the new community center built with his funding. In the photo, Lisa stood surrounded by children and volunteers, tired yet radiant, her smile wide and genuine. Richard stared at the image, feeling a lump in his throat. He realized that his journey was not about winning Lisa's forgiveness or reclaiming his old identity. It was about becoming someone he could be proud of. Redemption, he understood, was not a destination but a continuous path. Over the following weeks, Richard's transformation deepened. He began questioning the practices at Stone Enterprises, advocating for fair wages, ethical sourcing, and community investment policies that drew both praise and criticism from his peers. Meanwhile, Lisa expanded Hope Rise's programs, opening new community centers and launching job training initiatives, always emphasizing that their mission was not tied to one man's money. Late at night, when the city quieted, Lisa found herself thinking about Richard not as the man who had once used her for a bet, but as the man he was becoming. On a crisp autumn evening at the grand opening of Hope Rise's newest center, Lisa stood on the steps greeting families streaming in. Amid the crowd, she noticed Richard, a far cry from the man in his old tailored suit, now dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, looking nervous as he held a small envelope. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the bustling noise faded. "Richard," Lisa said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" He offered a tentative smile. "I heard about the opening. I wanted to see it for myself." Lisa studied him, noting the subtle changes, a quieter, more grounded presence. "It's a big night," she remarked, gesturing to the vibrant center. "You should be proud." Richard's expression softened. "This is incredible, Lisa," he said sincerely. Then, holding out the envelope, he added, I wanted to give you this a personal donation, no strings attached. Lisa accepted it, her eyes searching his. You didn't have to come here for that, she replied. I didn't come just for the donation. Richard hesitated, then admitted, I came because I wanted to see you. Her heart tightened, though she kept her guard up. I'm sorry, Lisa, he continued, voice breaking slightly, not just for the bet, but for dismissing you and trying to control everything, for not seeing you for who you are from the start. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Do you understand what you've done? You didn't just lie, you used me. You turned marriage, something deeply personal, into a stunt. Richard's voice faltered. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I had to tell you the truth. Lisa's voice rose. The truth doesn't erase the fact that you played with my life and the trust one gave you. Desperation welled up in Richard as he pleaded, please, let me prove that I've changed. But Lisa's expression remained resolute. Actions mean more than words, Richard. And no amount of apologies can undo the hurt. As she turned and walked away, Richard called after her, his voice raw with desperation. Please, just let me prove to you that I'm different. She paused at the door, replying firmly, proving yourself with empty words isn't enough when it comes at the expense of someone's dignity. The door closed quietly, leaving Richard alone in a vast, empty penthouse that suddenly felt meaningless. In the days that followed, Richard's loneliness deepened. He threw himself into work, yet even his ambitious projects felt shallow. Meanwhile, Lisa pressed on with Hope Rise, determined not to let Richard's betrayal derail her mission. Although she recognized that his recent actions were genuine, the foundation of their relationship had been built on deceit, a wound not easily healed. In an effort to atone, Richard donated millions to Hope Rise and began reforming Stone Enterprises, championing policies that prioritized ethics over profit. These changes earned him both acclaim and criticism, but for the first time, he no longer cared about the approval of his former social circle. One evening, as Richard sat alone in his penthouse, a photo of Lisa and the new community center flashed across his screen, a reminder of the progress made through genuine change. In that moment, he understood that his journey wasn't about reclaiming his old identity, but about becoming a man of substance, someone who could look in the mirror and feel pride. If he was to rebuild what had been lost, it would begin with him, his character, his actions, not just his wealth or connections. Over time, Richard continued to support Hope Rise from a respectful distance, gradually earning the trust of the staff and volunteers. One afternoon, while working side by side at a food drive, Lisa finally said, "You've changed, Richard." He replied quietly, I see things differently now." Lisa added softly, "Change isn't enough on its own, it must last. It takes time to build trust." Richard agreed, "I'm willing to wait, to prove I'm capable of real change." Months later, at another Hope Rise event, they stood together not as adversaries, but as partners, bound by a hard-won mutual respect. As the sun set over the city, Richard turned to Lisa. "Thank you for giving me a chance to change," he said quietly. Lisa's eyes softened as she replied, "Just don't waste it, Richard." And for the first time, they stood not as opponents or strangers, but as equals, ready to face whatever came next together. The story's conclusion delivers a powerful message about transformation and redemption, showing that true change begins when we open ourselves to vulnerability and genuine connection. It teaches us that no matter how successful or powerful we appear, our lives are enriched by empathy and a willingness to serve others. Richard's journey from an arrogant billionaire to a man dedicated to making a meaningful difference illustrates that material wealth alone is hollow if it does not lead to personal growth and compassionate action. His immersion in Lisa's world, where he learns firsthand about the struggles of ordinary people, reveals that redemption is not achieved through grand gestures, but through consistent, humble efforts to understand and uplift those around us. Moreover, the narrative emphasizes that accountability and self-reflection are key to overcoming past mistakes. As Richard gradually transforms his approach to life and business, we are reminded that real fulfillment comes from the positive impact we have on our community and the sincere relationships we build. Ultimately, the story encourages us to question our own priorities, embrace change, and strive to live a life of integrity and compassion, proving that even the most hardened hearts can learn to care. Thank you for reading this story of unexpected challenges, personal transformation, and the difficult journey toward redemption.